Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. I'm your host, Hena Zuberi, and you're watching us on Muslim Network TV. Today, we're going to continue our conversation with Brother Moazzam Begg, who is here with us from Birmingham, England. Brother Moazzam, as all of you, for those of you who know him, is a former prisoner from Guantanamo Bay Prison. He was born and raised in Birmingham, England, where he established an Islamic bookstore and aided in relief efforts in Bosnia and Afghanistan. Since his release, he has returned to England and speaks and lectures widely. He's written his book, Enemy Combatant, is available on Amazon, and we'll be discussing the book, the recent letter that former prisoners have written to President Biden, and many more, and much more about his work as the outreach director for CAGE, a UK-based advocacy organization. Thank you so much, Assalamu alaikum, for being here.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sister Hena, and my pleasure to be speaking here to you all this evening.
Alhamdulillah. We left off speaking about the work and your reception back into England after you came back. When I reflect back on your journey, and there's just so many questions that people ask and want to know, and you did mention how you survived those years and the tawakkul on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you had during that time. Recently, both you and Dr. Asim Qureshi, who's also part of CAGE, you spoke on Clubhouse. So that was a conversation that many were following, and too bad there is not a recording. That's something that Clubhouse doesn't invite. So what was the discussion about?
Oh, goodness. Well, there is a recording. If you do want to see it, it's on SoundCloud, which you can see if you go to the CAGE site on Facebook. You'll find it, CAGE. But essentially, the discussion was, and it's a discussion that would, or discussions, a series of discussions that would happen often in Guantanamo, but rarely outside of Guantanamo. And they are discussions to do with the issue of fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence, how you derive certain rulings about Muslims in particular positions. And they were to do with prayer, they were to do with fasting, they were to do with purification, wudu, and all of these normal things that Muslims do. But the questions were focused around, how do you pray with a hood over your head and your hands tied behind your back and your legs shackled to the ground? How do you perform wudu or even ghusl when you only have a 500 milliliter bottle per day to drink from and nothing else? How do you memorize the Quran when the Quran itself is torn into pieces and thrown into the toilet? How do you preserve the Quran? How do you pray when you don't know which way the Qibla is and you don't know what time of day it is? So it was all of these questions. And of course, if you think about the books of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, and so forth, they cover a vast array from all four major schools of thought and beyond, of questions about this particular thing where fatwa and so forth are given. And yet here, in these unique circumstances, the prisoners and what I would say the scholars from amongst the prisoners, of whom there were a handful, derived rulings of how you would actually carry out those things. How do you fast, for example, when there is no food to open your fast with? Literally, there's no food, there's no water. What do you do? Do you fast? Do you shorten your prayers as a traveler, as one who's been held against his own will in a place that's far off from you? Or do you complete your prayers so that shortening of your prayers isn't something that becomes normalized? So it was all of these questions, and it was a fascinating discussion, which again is, as I said, common for the Guantanamo prisoners, uncommon for those outside. I think you're on mute, sister. You're on mute.
This is the catchphrase for this pandemic, subhanAllah. when we think about our Uyghur sisters right now, this is something that I think about a lot, and I know some of the other sisters who were working on this, on the Uyghur crisis and the genocide. what what's happening there, what's happening inside, how are they praying when even saying Allah's name, like there's a story that had come out from from the camps, that someone said Allah's name, just like how inadvertently you say it, like you get hurt and it just comes out, and for that they were so severely punished for saying it, even in an almost unconscious state. So what does worship look like in a state like that?
That's Jazakallah khair, honestly, for making that comparison, because sometimes we think that our situation was bad, and then you realize that there are situations far worse. My evidence for this, of course, my point of reference often is Guantanamo and the Guantanamo prisoners. There's a friend of mine, he's a Uyghur, of which he was in Guantanamo also. There were 22 of them there, and he's a good friend, and we had a discussion recently with Sister Aidan Anwar, from the Uyghur rights movement in America, and Professor Steve, I forget his name.
Down, Steve
Sorry?
Down.
No, he wrote the book on the Uyghurs. It's right, but Sean Roberts. Sorry, Sean
Oh,
Roberts. Um, and so as we were talking, something Sister Aidan picked up on. She said that when Muhammad, the Uyghur brother, was speaking, he said, we were sold over, we were detained by Pakistani authorities, and then sold for a bounty to the Americans. But there were also Chinese that had offered bounties to the Pakistanis. But thank Allah that we weren't handed over to them. And it was a blessing for us that we ended up in Guantanamo, rather than where we could have ended up in China, where our other relatives are in prison, where they are forced to renounce their shahada. The Americans, as bad as they may have been, were nowhere near, I mean, not even close to what's happening to the brothers and sisters in East Turkestan. And, sitting in my house, I've had American soldiers, I think I've spoken to you before, and American soldiers who served in Guantanamo have come and visited me in my home. I've met American different politicians and so forth. I couldn't have imagined that happening with the Uyghurs, and the treatment they've received. So it's really important, and I'm glad that you made that point, because in that circumstance, in a circumstance like that, you're almost probably, just to survive, saying a word of kufr, disbelief, on your tongue to protect yourself and your family, and your iman really is in your heart, and you have to hide it. Just like Ammar bin Yasser was literally forced to say the word of kufr because his mother and father were being killed in front of him, but his heart was filled with iman. And I think my belief is that this is the situation of the Uyghurs, that it is so bad. And again, I'm glad that you made that comparison.
No, subhanAllah, yes. And Aideen is, close colleague. She just took HADIS. She still sits on our Save Uyghur campaign, Shura. So alhamdulillah, I'm glad she's getting out there and speaking in England as well, and other people are recognizing amazing young woman. May Allah bless her. So let's talk about this letter that you. So it's an open letter to President Biden about Guantanamo. By Mansour Adayfi, Moazzam Begg, Lakhdar Balmidian, Sami Al-Hajj, and Ahmed Iradici. Um, and it starts off, President Bush opened it. President Obama promised to close it, but failed to do so. President Trump promised to keep it open. Now it's your turn to decide. So tell us the story behind this letter and what you all are hoping to accomplish with this.
Well, what we have done is pen this letter together, and we could have done a letter by a bunch of former Guantanamo prisoners in and of itself, but these are former Guantanamo prisoners who have all authored books about their lives and their life in Guantanamo in particular. All of us here from different parts of the world. Mansour is from Yemen. I'm from the UK. Lakhdar is from France. Sami al-Hajj is from Qatar, Ahmed al-Rashidi is from Morocco, and Musa Zamouri is from Belgium. So all of these authors, literally from all around the world, have penned this letter. And what we've essentially done, what we did, is to call upon Biden's understanding and a look at history of Guantanamo, what he wants to leave as a legacy, but also to uh, call to that part of which he's at least said that he believes in the concept of justice. He's also said at his inaugural speech that the world will watch them and account them for what they do next for these in these big worldly issues. But most importantly, we've offered him an 8-point plan, a simple, easy, doable, manageable plan, which he can follow through with his administration and close Guantanamo as a result of that. It's not difficult, but there has to be an imperative. The imperative must be first that we fully intend, not that I say I want to close Guantanamo. We've heard that by every president except Trump. Trump actually quite clearly said, I'm going to keep it open. But George Bush, though he did open the place, he released over 500 plus prisoners. And before he left, he said he wants to close Guantanamo. Obama almost rode on the wave of I want to close Guantanamo, change has come to America. And he signed the executive order, and he was blocked by Congress, and he was unable to do so throughout the entire tenure of his presidency. So Trump, of course, we know, and so Biden now, he was part of that administration. He was the vice president. So he should now be able to follow through with that which his party had claimed that they wanted to do. And so we've offered these 8 points, which include amongst them that all those cleared for release. It beggars belief that people cleared for release are still in prison. So there's at least 7 or 8 who are actually cleared by all of the various bodies, cleared for release, yet they sit in prison and they were never charged with a crime. And there are people like Ahmed Rabbani, who's Pakistani. There's people like Harun Asadullah, who's Afghani. There's people like Muhammad Rahim al-Afghani. They could easily go back home. Abdul Latif Nasser, who's from Morocco. Again, all these guys cleared could easily go home tomorrow. Then there are others known as the so-called forever prisoners. And the forever prisoners, again, you think of this concept. A forever prisoner would be somebody who's committed a very heinous crime, and he's received a life sentence, and where the term life, when the judge pronounces life, he says, life in your case means life. It doesn't mean 30 years, it doesn't mean 25 years, it means life. The forever prisoner is that. That's what a forever prisoner is. The only problem is that they've never been charged with a crime, let alone prosecuted in court or convicted and sentenced. Now, this is America that we're talking about. This isn't China. This isn't those other places where those expectations don't happen. So there's all of this stuff. The concept has to be removed. They've been interrogated by the CIA, by the FBI, by military intelligence, by every US law enforcement agency and intelligence agency. And if you haven't got a case against them after 20 years, you're never going to have one. So those are the two major parts. And the other major part that we've asked for, there are, as I said, 8 points, and you can take a look at them, inshallah, on the New York Review of Books, which is where it was published, website. The other part of it is that the Office for the Opening for Resettlements, the resettlement program, is reestablished. And that is where a representative of the United States government seeks homes for prisoners who can't return for fear of torture. So, for example, Uyghurs would be an important case here. There are no more Uyghurs anymore, but had there been, this office would have made sure that homes are found for people who can't return to a place like China, because you don't go from Guantanamo and then straight to China to another prison. And that has happened in the case of several prisoners, that they were released only to be detained in their home countries. And the only reason they were detained in their home countries was because you were a prisoner in Guantanamo. America couldn't have held you for no reason, therefore you need to come back in prison. And that's the type of compounded injustice that exists, and I have to say, sadly, and as I'm sure you know, mostly in the Muslim and Arab world. That type of injustice perpetuates, it continues. And another thing we've asked for is that because of this, there were 23 prisoners, 23, it's a very large number, that were released from Guantanamo and sent to the United Arab Emirates, every single one of them was imprisoned and remained in prison for years. Only four have been released, and they were all Afghans. One of them died last year. His name is uh, Hamidullah Tarakhaid. And he said, this is the shocking part. He's a very old man. He said, I was imprisoned by the Soviet Union when they invaded my country. I was imprisoned for 5 years and I fought against them. Then he said that after that, of course, I was imprisoned in Guantanamo, and I was also imprisoned in the United Arab Emirates. The worst treatment I ever received wasn't by the Soviets and it wasn't by the Americans. It was by the United Arab Emirates. And he explains in detail the kind of abuses that they encountered. And so now there are still 18 Yemeni prisoners held in this place. They were never charged with a crime. They're being held in solitary confinement, even as we speak, in the United Arab Emirates. And despite the promises that they were told that they would be released and freed and try to build their life, they've gone from prison 14 years in Guantanamo and 3 more in United Arab Emirates. And that's the shocking thing that continues to this day. So we've asked in this letter that this treatment doesn't happen.
And remembering, just reminding the audience that these people have not been either not been charged with a crime or have been exonerated from after
Yeah.
many investigation.
Yeah.
Where would they go? So if not many of these majority Muslim countries where they would be detained, and which other countries have offered to open their doors up to.
Okay, so the resettlements program, it was actually fairly successful. The United States had managed to, and I was involved in some of those negotiations myself. I met with governments of various countries, especially within Europe, with some of the leaders of some of those countries, in fact. And some of them agreed to take one or two. What they did is one prisoner here, two prisoners here, five here. And I said the largest number that I've heard of in one group was this at the Emirates. But for the most part, people aren't sent to dungeons again. For the most part, they are sent to a country, and there's about 45 different countries where people were sent to, resettled to, and they do vary. Like the Uyghurs, the really interesting thing about the Uyghurs, that it was hard to find homes for them. So they found islands, tiny little islands that most people wouldn't have been able to recognize on the map of the globe. So there are 4 Uyghurs sent to Bermuda. There are 2 Uyghurs sent to El Salvador. There are another 6 sent to Albania. There are 6 more that are sent to this tiny little island called Palau, which is just off the coast of the Philippines. And this is because of the influence of China and the trade relations China has with other nations. So the Muslim countries, not a single Muslim country offered refuge, not a single one offered refuge to the Uyghurs. Um, and there are other countries, Eastern European countries, where some have been sent. There are countries in Western Europe also that have accepted prisoners. The United States have not taken anybody, not a single person. And so, unfortunately, it's harder to find places, but there are still some places. Turkey is a good option. Qatar is a good option. South Africa is a good option. Malaysia is a good option. So these are all Muslim countries where a person could return to, or where there are Muslim populations, where a person could go and build a life where where it's possible to at least have a meaningful life rather than going to a place. Imagine, there were I think 4 Syrians and 2 Tunisians sent to Uruguay. And again, so how do you pick up your life in a place where you don't know a single thing? There is no masjid, there's no community, there's no language. And the amazing thing is that some of the prisoners have managed to build their lives in these completely obscure corners of the world.
Now, some of the detainees that we hear about, and I wanted to know if you've had any interactions with them. For example, Muhammad Sadiq, who arrived at the age of 89, or the youngest ones, Abdul Quddus or Asadullah, Najibullah. Could you tell us more about them?
Yeah. So the eldest one, I didn't know, I didn't know him in Guantanamo, but I met him in Bagram, and in fact, they were prisoners older than that. Though I don't think they were sent to Guantanamo. They were, and in Afghanistan, in Pashto, they're called the Spingira, the greybeards, the whitebeards rather, and very well respected as elderly people. But I saw them deeply mistreated by the Americans. Unfortunately, not all American soldiers mistreated them, but they were mistreated. They were treated like youngsters. Um, I remember he had a hearing aid. They took his hearing aid away because they said you could use this as some kind of a device. Another had a false leg. He had a leg that was, um, in fact, several. There were several amputees, and there were some double amputees who had lost their legs um, because of the mines laid by the Russians. And that's quite common in Afghanistan. We're a heavily mined country. And many of them had fought the Soviets and so forth. So it was quite shocking. They take their legs away, take their false prosthetic legs away. So they wanted to walk. They'd be crawling on the floor just to go to the bathroom or to the water to get some water or something. So it was quite shocking to see people in that way. Um, and then of course there was the youngsters. The youngsters, there were many youngsters, um, ranging from one, I believe he said, though I'm not sure totally, it's either 12 or 13, and his name is Mohammed Jawad. He's Afghani. I've spoken to him several times since his return. And again, the beauty of the Guantanamo prisoners that I know, every single one of them that I can think of, they neither hold a grudge, they neither seek vengeance, they are neither bitter. Um, in fact, just this evening I was speaking to one, Mansour Defi, who's a Yemeni. He's actually thanks Allah for being sent to Guantanamo. He's one of the authors, also the first author of the letter. He thanks Allah for allowing him to become himself in Guantanamo, discover himself, and um, as I said, many of them made friendships with the guards and so forth. But to get back, uh, the other youngsters include Omar Khadr, who's the Canadian, and again, you probably would have come across Omar Khadr. There's lots said about him, but when he speaks, he melts people's hearts. He says, "You can say about me what you want to, but let me show you who I am. Don't you determine who I am based upon, as they say in Arabic, qil wa qal, he said and she said, or this was said. Watch me as a person, see how I conduct myself. Then you make a decision, a determination on me." And so some of these young boys, literally boys, I first saw Omar Khadr in Bagram when they brought him in, and he was terribly wounded. He had exit wound, a gunshot wound right from the top of his shoulder. He had one eye was he was blind in one eye. I mean, he looked like a walking dead body, uh, and he was just 13 to 14 years old at the time. And he grew into a man in Guantanamo, and a man that people are proud of, a man who the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, apologized to personally. Um, so there are people like that, and alhamdulillah, as I said, that whatever people may think of the prisons in Guantanamo, until they see them and speak with them and interact with them, they can never know.
That is I mean, even your book, right? The Enemy Combatant. That's how people view these young people or people there, because that's all they have been taught. So uh, what have you experienced? How many of them are willing to be in the public eye and speak up, and how many prefer to just forget this experience because they've gone through such extreme mental torture? um, please share.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? This is a fraternity that has been created for
Mm,
us. We weren't seeking it, but it became such. So there is now a bond between former Guantanamo prisoners that's very, very powerful. Even if many of us never met one another ever. I mean, I was in solitary confinement most of my time in Guantanamo, so I only met a handful of prisoners. I've got to know them after I was released,
mm,
and I speak to. I mean, every day I'm speaking to one prisoner or another, former prisoner or another, about one thing or the other. Either those who are in the public arena are very few, and there are reasons for that.
mm,
Much of that has to do with where they're from. Interestingly, the largest number of prisoners was from Saudi Arabia, but you'll never hear Saudi Arabian prisoners speaking about anything, and that is the nature of Saudi Arabia as an oppressive regime. Those who, as I said, There are others sent to other parts of the world where they speak, but they speak about very specific things because of the nature of their government and the nature of their relationship with the United States of America that they don't want to damage. In Western countries, they've been more vocal. But as I know from a very personal experience, that if you take on this role, you must prepare yourself for attacks, and not just attacks by ordinary people from behind screens, but governments, powerful governments can make your life difficult. So that's something you have to prepare for, and that's why, alhamdulillah, as being a member of the organization Cage, I get that support. I get the support of the work that I do. I get the support of colleagues, but that isn't for everybody, and everybody isn't, as I say, privileged as we are sitting in the UK. Um, Nonetheless, I'll give you one example of the types of things people have done. One former prisoner called Walid al-Hajj. He's a Sudanese guy who was held in Guantanamo for 6 years. He went through a really horrific experience even before Guantanamo, where over 600 prisoners were held in a place and only 500 survived. The rest were all killed by American and Allied forces, and they were bombed while they were in a shelter.
Mm.
He speaks about a place where they diverted a river. The U.S. forces and Afghan forces diverted a river to drown out these prisoners. And when that didn't work, they poured in fuel and lit that. They lit this. And what the thing he told me, I remember, it still shocks me to the core. He said, when that water came, we hadn't drunk water for 6 days. And many of our friends were dead. They were floating in this water. And the water was rising. We thought, this is it. That's it. We're going to die now. He said, but even in that, we saw a blessing from Allah. Despite this water being filled with all the diesel, the urine, feces, sweats, dust, when the water came and they were using this water to try to kill us, we started to drink it.
Oh, subhanAllah.
And he's somebody who survived from that. And from there, he went to Guantanamo. So when he came out, he became a sensation in the Arab world. Al Jazeera did 10 one-hour episodes with him in an important series of interviews where Ahmed Mansour does interviews with him, a famous Arab anchor. And again, you can see in him calmness, lack of vengeance, lack of hatred, just telling the story as it is. Very, very calm, very soft individual. And that has been my experience. As I said, I can't state that enough from all of the prisoners that I speak to regularly. I think the world could listen to these guys if they could take away the mist that surrounds the idea of former Guantanamo prisoners and Muslims and so forth, and say that whatever you say these guys stand accused of, let them tell you their experience and what they've learned, their analysis of 15, 16 years in prison, which society could benefit from.
Mm. Is there a way to assist families or the ones that have been repatriated but are struggling with funds? Because a lot of people ask that how can we help? We weren't able to speak up then. Now we want to help, or we want to speak up on this.
Yeah. I mean, we ourselves at Cage and there are different projects. There's a Reprieve, it's an organization that defends the Guantanamo prisoners. They have something called the Life After Guantanamo Project, which is, there's a whole host of difficulties. Imagine, like I said, a young Yemeni man, barely speaks English, let alone any other language, is now resettled to Serbia. Um, he knows nobody, knows nothing. And he's given a short amount for a couple of years, he's given a little bit of money to take care of himself. And after that, you're on your own. You don't know the language, you haven't got any access. You've been in prison for 14 years, tortured, and you have no way to pick your life up. And yet these guys are picking their lives up somehow. Um, there are various projects that, inshallah, if people want to get in touch with Cage later on, where we try to, if we can, if we're able to, assist the person in what they're seeking. So if they need help financially in doing a study course, if they're trying to build a business, if they're trying to um, get higher education and so forth, we do direct people to where they can assist those particular individual prisoners. There are, of course, others, like I said, that people who need assistance after they're released, like, for example, the Yemenis, they're amongst the poorest prisoners. Their families are very, very poor, and they're just trying to find a way to secure some kind of safety for their relatives. But because it's very widely spread, there isn't one sole place where we can say that there's a single campaign, but there are several individuals who you can, inshallah, assist, and we can assist you in getting to help them directly.
Thank you. So that would be cage.uk. Could you share the link so people can visit? There you go. Take cage.ngo/Guantanamo. We often get questions of how we can help. Well, this is a way you can help. These brothers and sisters are actively working on these cases and have direct contact with detainees. Now that um, now that you look at it from the perspective of having that distance, like what would you change about the book that you have written? Would you add? Would there be a second version?
There's definitely a second version. I have already written sort of an introduction to a new book that I'm doing. That's a follow, and it's really not much about Guantanamo. It's about life after Guantanamo, and yes, it does deal with or does address visiting. Let me tell you this little short story so that you have an idea of the types of things that's going on in my mind. I went once to a country called Slovakia, where 3 prisoners have been resettled, including one Egyptian, a Tunisian, and somebody from Azerbaijan. Now, they were sent to this tiny little village, or small town rather, at the top of the border with Poland, where there's no Muslims. There's no dark faces there, let alone Muslims. It's an old sort of Soviet bloc era region where everything's just concrete, and they were very out of place there. When I arrived, I had some gifts, bags of gifts, some quite heavy gifts for them. And the brother who came to meet me was an Egyptian. We welcomed one another, and I didn't know him from before, but embraced. And as I was carrying all these heavy things, I noticed he was not helping me. And we had a 3-hour journey from my place to his place, and then we went to his flat, and we climbed up the stairs. He still didn't help, and I was struggling to get these up. And I thought, what a strange brother this is. And then the salah time came, and we stood next to one another, and my foot was next to his foot. And I realized why he hadn't helped me. Because he has a prosthetic leg. And his leg was amputated in Guantanamo within the first few days of getting there. And he, in this place, now he was a father. He had 4 children that he hadn't seen now for, I think, 9 years in Egypt. And he was now starting to speak to them. They didn't send him back to Egypt because this was before the revolution, and he would have instantly gone to prison. So my point in saying all of this is that these are the stories that will be coming out. This and many, many more stories of traveling around the world and meeting such people, amazingly wonderful people with hearts of gold. And the experience of that. I traveled then also to many other countries, and it wasn't just Guantanamo prisoners that I was meeting with and getting, seeing their stories, but it was prisoners from around the war on terrorism. Which I discovered, of course, included much of the Muslim world. People with rendition to Syria, to Libya, to Morocco, to Egypt, and I met prisoners from all of those places. Mute. Unmute.
Abdul Wahid, please make sure we cut that out when we broadcast. But these are the stories that perhaps some people are not storytellers themselves, and that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has given you that gift. So it would be, it is incumbent on you to write those stories and share them with the rest of the world, inshallah. I wanted to ask you. There's a big abolition movement here in the United States about abolishing prisons altogether. I'd love to get your take on that.
The really difficult thing is because we're all societies, parts of societies where we've known nothing but prison, and prison is for bad folks. So all our societies, whether it's America, here in Britain, Pakistan, wherever it is, there are prisons. Most people don't go to prison, but those who do, society says they must be by default bad. Now, the problem with that thesis is that we, of course, know let's just say people are bad, they've committed crimes and they must pay a price for that crime. The victim must be protected in one way or the other. That's one part of it. But uh, how many cases of miscarriages of justice have there been? Serious miscarriage of justice. Just to give you an example from here in Birmingham, a bombing took place in the 1970s and 6 individuals, Irishmen, were arrested for a crime and were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. I know their case well because I have the same lawyer. And they were released after it was found that the police had lied and held back exculpatory evidence that showed they couldn't have carried out the bombing. And it was not just in the case of these individuals, also a group called the Maguire Seven, the Guildford Four. In fact, a famous film was made called In the Name of the Father about this particular individual called Jerry Conlon, who was in prison for 16 years. His father came to campaign to have him released. They arrested his father. They imprisoned his father, and his father died in prison. It's a shocking, shocking story. And I remember my lawyer, she told me, listen, Moazzam, this was before I went to Guantanamo, but she said, when I met her on a campaign case, she said, it was the Irish first, but the Muslims are next. And that she was talking about Britain, and she was right. And she told me that in 1998. Yes, miscarriages of justice are very, very common. And in those cases, if you were to add up the years that these individuals had spent in prison, you're talking about hundreds of years spent in prison between them for crimes they didn't commit. So what do you do about that? What do you do? Doesn't the law say it's better that one person that nobody is imprisoned unjustly, rather than one person comes in and is held for a crime he commits? So the point about this, in short, I would say that prison cannot be the answer for anybody's life. It cannot. It doesn't work. Our prisons are full. I think America's prisons are even worse. And there's an entire complex, an industrial complex, a machine.
We're at the, I think our prison population is the largest in the entire world.
Yeah, it doesn't work. It's a failure. So my view about prison would be, and have been in prison. In 2014, I was imprisoned in Britain. Again, they tried to prosecute me for terrorism for sending a generator to Syria. Alhamdulillah, I won my case. I was declared innocent by the police, but I was held as a Category A prisoner, which means a top security prisoner, like as if I've committed. I was held next to mass murderers and next to gangland killers. And I was seen as dangerous as them because I sent a generator to the Free Syrian Army rebels, who the British government had been supporting before. But, as I say, never let the facts get in the way of a good demonization. And I discovered there very quickly that there's a process here of all these people becoming institutionalized, and many people coming into prison because that's all they know and that's where they feel safe. They actually feel safe. You've got a roof over your head, you've got 3 meals a day, and as long as you're with a group of people, you're protected. So what kind of culture has that created? And it's across the world. It's not just America or Britain, it's across the world. And then you look at the numbers of people who reoffend, as it were, or if they weren't big offenders before they came to prison, they become afterwards. Where do they meet all the criminal elements? How do they hone their skills? It happens there. I've seen it. So it doesn't work out. I think solutions-wise, I can't offer a silver magic bullet solution. But what we do is, if we eliminate what doesn't work, then we've got to work on something else and try and find out other solutions.
So on a personal level, what changes have you incorporated in your life before prison and after prison? Recently I was talking to a young sister who was was incarcerated, and one of the things that she said, well, I never realized that stripping away of everything that I owned And even though it was a very short stay, she stayed for about 3 weeks and then she was let go. And that, just that realization that nothing is really mine. And that brought change into her life. So, what about you? What was like when you look back at yourself and you look at yourself now? Oops.
I don't know if that I was probably a better person in prison than I am out of prison. I think that would be correct to say that. I think wholeheartedly would be correct. And that is because in prison you are obviously denied the most the things that we most cherish, I guess, but without realizing it. So most people understand and cherish freedom, but they take it for granted. So they don't really appreciate it. And you don't appreciate something until it's gone, right? We all know this from whether it's human beings, relationships, things, material things. We don't appreciate things until they're gone properly. Uh, so I would say uh, that being in prison made me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I was reading more Quran, memorizing more Quran. I was contemplating more about life and its purposes and its meaning, and my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My worship was longer, my qiyam al-layl existed much more than it does now. Um, my turning to Allah happened far more than it does now. My contemplation of the verses of the Quran happened certainly far more than it does now. I even read more. I was even reading more books because now everything is sort of digital and digitized. So you're watching videos and looking at things and wasting time where you probably wouldn't have. So in prison, all of those things, I see them as blessings. In fact, even I was even more physically fit in prison than I am now. And so, not that I wish prison upon anyone, but there's no getting away from the fact that such an environment, if you can create an environment in which you can gain from those things that you take for granted and cherish them in real meaning, in meaningful terms, whether it's family, whether it's your freedom, whether it's your education, whether it's your health, all of those things, you should really take advantage of them. And of course, the biggest thing, I think, one of the biggest things rather, is your ability to assist others. If you can, you're very limited. I mean, you can help people in prison with certain things, um, but if you don't take advantage of helping others when you're a free person, it becomes very hard to do that when you're outside. I mean, how do you assist those who are in need through drought, through war, through famine, whether they need support like we do the work of Cage, helping people who've been targeted unnecessarily by the security services. So it's better that you do this now than when you no longer have the ability to do so. And this reminds me of Hadith of the Prophet. He said, "Take care of five before five," which includes uh, your your wealth. Take care of your wealth before you become poor. Take care of uh, your youth before you become old. Take care of your health before you become sick, and of course, most importantly, take care of your life before you die.
Subhanallah. And this also brings me back to where you started from, because you started off as an aid worker, bringing relief. And I know it just, hours passed so quickly. We didn't get to talk about this last time too, and I really want to touch on your time in Afghanistan. And I know we may not be able to squeeze it in the next 6 to 8 minutes, but I'd love to hear more about your time there. What were you doing there? What and I've heard some of these stories in other places, and I'd love for our audience to hear them as well. Perhaps one or two stories that you could share from your time in Afghanistan.
So I've been to Afghanistan a couple of times, but the time that I spent there the most was when I went in 2001 in the summer with my family, with my wife and kids, and I was there at the time. Yes, of course, the Taliban were in power, and they weren't keen on any Western education system coming in, but they were happy for Muslims to bring it in, Western Muslims to bring in various education systems and so forth. And we'd helped to set up a school, where it set up the curriculum and brought in playground equipment and I helped to teach there.
Mm.
And there was a boys' girl school and a sister girls' school. So there was education for girls, but under the rules of the Taliban, not under kind of Western rules. Um, you know, I can only describe certain things that are in my mind at that time. I remember once seeing a Taliban military parade. It was really strange because it's not like any. I've never seen a military parade anyway, but it's not like anything you see on the TV. But with the Taliban, it was really funny because I remember once they were doing kind of one of the guys. He had an RPG, like sort of rocket in his hand, and instead of using a stick to kind of push people back because there's so many people, he was using this RPG grenade thing to push people back. I thought, oh goodness, you know, what did he do? There's funny little things like that. I remember I saw this game called Buzkashi, which is a
Mm.
famous game, which you must have played with the carcass of a dead goat and the horsemanship, mostly Turkoman horsemen, um, riding and vying for this goat carcass. I think you see it played in Rambo 3.
Mm.
It was just amazing to watch that. It was amazing to go into Kabul and to see this lion, this famous one-eyed lion that's in the little pit. And there's a story behind the one-eyed lion is that um, some man fell inside the pit, or he was playing around and being silly, and he fell in the pit where the lion was, and the lion ended up killing the man. So his brother came back the next day and threw a grenade at the lion, and the lion was, um, blind in its eye.
One.
I mean, there are all these crazy stories. But having said that, Afghanistan was a place that fascinated me. It fascinated me because in this picturesque place, so many nations, the British had come before, the Soviets had come, and now the Americans obviously came afterwards. I think to myself, oh, it's poor. It's a very poor country, but there's just something about that place that attracts powers for some reason all the time for decades on end. And I still haven't been able to put my finger on it exactly, but whoever does faces, turmoil there. And I was happy to have lived there at a time where at least there was peace for a while.
Mm.
Um, I could go on and on, but I know there's not a great deal of time.
Yes, it definitely. I was at the border and I was turned away. So I wasn't allowed to go in because I didn't have a mahram with me
Oh,
at that time, and all my colleagues who were non-Muslim were allowed to go in. But I assumed that this was something Allah Subhanahu wa Taala was saving me from, perhaps that we weren't, my team wasn't allowed to from the Turkhan border. We were trying to get in to film, and I wasn't allowed to. So this was around 1998. But yes, that I would, at that time, the footage that would come out from a lot of the journalists that went in, I'd help edit and produce, I was a production assistant with them as well. So, and what it was just fascinating to watch the society under the Taliban, the good, the bad, the ugly, and they had an embassy at that time in Pakistan that was run, and it was the Taliban were running the embassy. So if you needed to go interview somebody from the Afghan government, it was the Taliban that you interviewed. And so yeah, it was. But sometimes we have Afghan activists come in and speak on the show, and it's subhanallah, 20 years have gone by, 30, 25 almost now, and things just subhanallah, the resilience of that country is just amazing.
I mean, I didn't realize that you'd gone over there. Of course, the Torkham border is a place that I'd gone across from several times, um, in and out of Pakistan. But uh, the interesting thing, coming back to the kind of Guantanamo thing, because as you know, 5 Guantanamo senior members of the Taliban were released in a prisoner exchange with the Americans, Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, and they set up the office for what they call for the Islamic Emirate in Qatar, and they began the major peace talks with the United States of America. Now I know they're going up and down, but the point is that my point was the experience of Guantanamo has taught everybody something, including those Taliban leaders. Yes, of course, they say that the Americans must leave, but they want peace. They say that our country's had enough of war, and they're right. They know that war is not sustainable. and it doesn't help anybody. And there has to be another way. There has to be. And this idea of talking to your enemy is very important. I wholeheartedly support it. It's something that I learned from Guantanamo very early on with former Guantanamo guards and soldiers. And to this day, I have them, so many of them contacting me regularly that it's hard to describe. And they all recognize that this notion of perpetual war uh, is just deeply destructive for everybody.
Jazakallah khair. We're at the end of our hour, and just a pleasure always talking to you, inshallah. We appreciate the work that Cage does across the border, across the Pacific, Atlantic, and hope that we can partner in the following, in the coming years. We try to do human rights work in the Muslim framework. Here in the United States, trying to establish this on wherever we can, in whatever way we can. So, Jazakallah khair for being here.
My pleasure, absolute pleasure, and any time. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow you to continue to do your work in all that is good and to spread your message of fighting for the rights of those who've been oppressed.
Ameen, ameen. So, for all of you who are watching, thank you so much for joining us. You can always watch us on MuslimNetwork.tv. One of the things that I did want to point out this coming week, is that we're going to be focusing on the plight of Uyghur sisters and the unique way Uyghur women are being oppressed under this genocide. In the following 3 days, I am going to have guests. There are camp survivors who have been in positions, they've been teachers in the camps, or have been detainees themselves. So please do. They've been interviewed by many non-Muslims, but I don't think that they have been interviewed by a Muslim sister. So I'm looking forward to those discussions to learn more, and hopefully to get all of you more involved with their plight, and hopefully you can say labbaik to their call. Assalamu alaikum.